Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Our guest today is Dr. Ian Lake from Gloucestershire in England. Dr. Lake, hello to Low Carb and Fasting.
Hi,
welcome.
thank you very much.
Well, Dr. Lake is a GP from Gloucestershire, as I said. Dr. Lake is also type 1 diabetic, like myself. So we're going to talk of low carbohydrate sort of intervention to help diabetics in general, but particularly type 1 diabetics, because Dr. Lake is specializes. He's one of the leading GPs in the UK who promotes the low carbohydrate lifestyle for type 1 diabetics. Dr. Lake, you're also one of the founding members of Public Health Collaboration.
Yes, that was a long time ago. That's about 7 years ago now. And I joined it really because of my interest in the low carbohydrate, but also because of the real food lifestyle, which low carbohydrate tends to go with.
Tell us more about your background and about when you first when you were first diagnosed as type 1 diabetic.
Okay, so I'm a GP and I was practicing as a GP because I developed type 1 diabetes later in life, in my 30s, 27 years ago now. And I was practicing the normal sort of nice guideline sort of way of managing diabetes with bolus insulins to match the carbohydrates, and then once daily basal insulin to stabilize the background requirements for insulin. And that didn't work that well, although I never really ended up in hospital, and I never had complications until 20 years of type 1 when I started to develop early retinopathy. In addition to that, I had what we call the soft signs of type 1, which is getting dizzy on standing up, joint aches, blurred vision with the glucose excursions, a little bit of fogginess of vision. And of course, all those things go along with type 1, as anyone listening with type 1 will know. So I'd already read Richard Bernstein's Diabetes Solution, which is about lowering the carbohydrate content to the minimum so that you need as little insulin as possible. I'd read it a year before that, but I felt it was a bit too high in fat for my tastes, and more to the point that I was trained that the low fat lifestyle was the best for heart disease prevention. And because people with type 1 diabetes obviously have more risk of heart disease, I felt it was a bit risky. But with nothing to lose, I tried the low carb lifestyle, and from day one I got very good results. And 6 years later, that continues to be the case. So I feel everyone should at least know about low carbohydrate lifestyles. Whether they choose to adopt it or not is up to them.
Has it made a difference to your health?
It's made an amazing difference. It's been transformational in my life. I've been very lucky in that my retinopathy has resolved. It was never very much in the first, it was very, very early. But normalizing the glucose has enabled me to live as near normal life as possible. So I can spend long periods of time not even worrying about my diabetes. And I feel much fitter, I feel much more mentally alert. My joint aches and pains have all gone, and so is my postural hypotension, feeling dizzy on standing. So I feel very, very lucky indeed. And I'm not going to change my lifestyle now because it suits me very well.
I must add here, my retinopathy has also been stable since starting low carbohydrate lifestyle after 43 years of having type 1 diabetes. So it's not progressing. It's just where it was when I first started low carbohydrate lifestyle. So you are an advocate of low carbohydrate sort of lifestyle. How do you do you basically go against NHS guidelines, because NHS guidelines are still recommending, eat what you want, live a normal life, and match your food with the right amount of insulin. So how do you go about it? What do you tell your diabetic patients when you're telling them to lower their carbohydrates? And then they tell you, well, at the clinic, my consultant didn't necessarily recommend this, or they said something different. How do you manage that? It's complicated.
Yes, I'm quite controversial in my medical world, really, from the point of view of how I manage my diabetes. However, it does seem very logical to minimize the amount of insulin that you can take, because you're putting insulin into the wrong part of the body, into the skin rather than into the veins internally. You're estimating when you may want to eat your food, and you're second guessing the amount of carbohydrate. So it's not an ideal situation. And it just seems that our bodies can do without insulin. I mean, I've halved my insulin requirements. I know some people have dramatically reduced their insulin requirements. And because we're lacking insulin, we have no insulin in our bodies, and we can run our bodies naturally on very little insulin. If we adopt a low carbohydrate lifestyle, it just seems to make sense that taking the risk out of managing type 1 by reducing the amount of insulin you need. Now, as type 1s, we'll never stop our requirements for insulin. That is important to say. We'll always need insulin, but we can reduce the amount we take dramatically. And I always say as much as needed, but as little as possible. And I think that's the safest way to stop complications. Now, there are two areas, aren't there, here? There's the low fat hypothesis, which the diet heart hypothesis, which says if you reduce your fat content, you will reduce your risk of heart disease. That has yet to be fully proven. And then there is the metabolic hypothesis, which says that it's the insulin that is actually promoting inflammation in the body, and that needs to be reduced in amount to improve metabolism and reduce your chances of having heart disease, etc. I did adhere to the former, the diet heart hypothesis, in the early days, and now I'm strongly in favor of metabolic management of type 1. So it's not easy to recommend something to patients, or I just say, well, this is information, you may want to look it up, because it may not suit everyone's lifestyle, and it's a fantastic way to control your diabetes, but people may want to take a look at it and may not want to do it. So I just provide the information, and patients can then decide if that's what they want to do. But having said that, the NICE guideline NG17, which is the type 1 guideline, does say that the clinician must respect the wishes of the patient, whatever type of diet they choose. Clearly, that will be managed depending on if the doctor clearly thinks the patient's making dangerous decisions. But by and large, keto isn't a dangerous decision, and it's actually safer. There are 5 times fewer hypos with a keto diet, and that was shown in as long ago as 2008 in a study by Jorgi Nielsen, who's a Swedish researcher in type 1.
Fascinating. There are definitely fewer hypers and fewer hypos.
Yes.
Which has been tremendously good for me as well. And seeing those sort of, CGMs. Let's talk about CGMs, because I was just about to mention my graph. I believe you also wear the Freestyle Libre. We're promoting the Freestyle Libre here because at the you wear the Dexcom, don't you, Dr. Lake? I wear the Freestyle Libre here. But...
Oh yeah, it's here, right up here. I've got a Medtrum, which is a rechargeable transmitter. I have to self-fund. I'm not getting my sensor on the National Health Service. I self-fund, and for me, the Medtrum is the cheapest option. The transmitter costs quite a lot, about £200, but the sensors are then £34 for 2 weeks. So it works out cheap, really. And because the sensor's rechargeable, it'll last nearly 2 years. The transmitter's rechargeable, it'll last nearly 2 years.
That's interesting, because it was never presented to me as an option. I never knew about it. So I self-funded the Libre for 4 years.
Yes.
Until just recently, when my GP just offered it to me. I don't know how it was just added next to my insulin in my repeat prescription, and I said nothing after 4 years of non-stop self-funding it. It does add up. So, do you think it's so? What's the reason it's not funded for type 1 diabetics? I'm not talking about all diabetics, but for specifically type 1s.
I think the aspiration is to allow every type 1 to have access to a CGM. It's quite costly. It costs several, I think a few £100 million to get this running. And I think initially it was rolled out to those deemed at highest risk. So people like ourselves on a keto diet are very low risk. so we weren't eligible. But it's becoming more and more available as the funding improves. So I think it's only a matter of time before all type 1s are offered a CGM. I think it's such an important tool in managing type 1. I don't know how you can do without it, really.
I wouldn't want to do without it. It's incredibly useful. Do you have anyone who's not type 1, any of your patients who's not type 1, but who are purchasing it at full price? I think Libre would be £65, because I think if you're not type 1, you would have to pay VAT on top of the product. So do you have anyone who's interested in it so much so that they are prepared to pay for it and self-fund it, even if it's for a short period of time?
Yes, quite a lot of people. I strongly suggest that people with type 2 who are transitioning to a low carb diet at least try this CGM for 2 weeks, so that they can see, give them a few things to try out, a few different foods, so they can see for themselves how different foods affect their blood glucose levels. So the people who are motivated will try their own. A lot of GPs are trying CGMs as well, and they're getting interesting results. So people who have no diabetes at all, as well as the type 2s, are using CGMs and getting interesting results, because there are several different types, aren't there, of metabolic profile. And with outside of type 2 diabetes, there are metabolic profiles. Some people get very insulin sensitive, some people more insulin resistant. And of course, we're starting to find out that the more insulin resistant people are much more vulnerable to carbohydrates than the insulin sensitive. So hopefully in 10 to 20 years' time, we'll be practicing a whole different type of medicine to the reactive medicine that we're practicing at the moment.
I very much hope so. So type 1s definitely can follow the low carbohydrate lifestyle to achieve better control of blood glucose. How about fasting? I mean, we are the low carb and fasting. I'm a big promoter of fasting myself. I practice fasting myself, and I know you also do. Tell us more about fasting for specifically type 1s.
Well, as most people with type 1 know, there are certain parts of the day when you are less responsive to your insulin because other things are going on in the background. So, for example, a lot of people in the mornings get a cortisol spike or an adrenaline spike, which is called the dawn effect. And that sometimes requires additional small units of rapid-acting insulin to correct that. And it makes sense to avoid food for several hours at a time, so you don't put the stress on your body with respect to carbohydrate ingestion. Even if you're low carb, you can still get away with 2 meals a day, which I do, and I eat in about an 8-hour window, ideally. Of course, like everyone else, I'm human and slip from time to time, but I try to avoid breakfast and have a late lunch and then reasonably early sort of evening meal. So I finish everything by 8 o'clock. So between 2 and 8 o'clock, I'll eat my set number of calories, if you like, and 2 meals without any snacks. And of course, it's very beneficial. So it increases insulin sensitivity. It promotes this phenomenon called autophagy or autophagy, where the body is good at self-repair. So it helps reduce inflammation a lot. So I think there's a lot to be said for it. And certainly if you're low carb, it's dead easy. If you're high carb, it's much more difficult because of the sheer high volumes of insulin, and you may need to add corrections by eating sort of at least glucose as form of snacks if you've got it wrong. Although some people can manage a high carbohydrate diet quite well. About 10% of people can manage a high carbohydrate diet to the levels that people on a keto diet can manage. Whereas 90% of people on a keto diet can manage their blood glucose almost to the normal range. So it's much more advantageous to go keto, in my view.
So you mentioned obviously intermittent fasting, sort of 18 hours of fasting per day, or 16 to 18 or to 20. How about longer fasts? Because let's talk about 0, 5, 100 project. I'm fascinated by it. I read the research fully, and I will put it in the notes on YouTube. Tell us more about that project. It was incredible, and I'm doing something similar.
Oh, you'll have to tell
an
us
experiment
about
on myself, and I will publish it. I will send you a copy of once I've finished typing everything up. But that's for later. Tell us about that project.
Fantastic. Well, the 05100
05100.
came about really because of the frustration of trying to say, well, low carbohydrate is a great option for type 1s and effectively being ignored by my colleagues in that sense. And most of the arguments were around diabetic ketoacidosis and the fact that you need sugar for energy, and the fact that if you're taking insulin, you have to have carbohydrates. And I knew none of those things were true. So I thought, well, how can I actually show that? And it came about sort of between Christmas and the New Year 2 years ago. And I just thought, we need to burn about 25,000 calories because that is our fat store. Our fat store's triple that. And we often say that now in meetings, oh, you've got 50,000, 100,000 calories of fat. So I thought, well, let's just prove it. So I thought, well, let's burn 25,000 calories of fat, which is a reasonable number of calories. And let's do it over 5 days. So we've fasted for 5 days. And that would enable us to be in absolute ketosis. I mean, there'd be no argument whether we're in ketosis or not. And let's do it without any food at all, without any sugar, unless we have to rescue a hypo. Just to show that if you take insulin, and we all, the two people who with type 1 diabetes who are on this 5-day trip, we managed to take insulin without needing carbohydrates. So all of the three main areas where clinicians had concerns were covered in one study. So we set off last year, about a year ago in 2020, and we went along the Kennet and Avon Canal, which is flat, of course, an easy track. And there are 8 people, and we all completed it very easily, and we had no hunger issues. Our mood was great all the way through because we're on ketone bodies, and ketones are very good for neuronal health and they're good brain food. I needed 78 calories of carbohydrates, which is about what is it? About 6 or 8 glucose tablets throughout the whole 5 days, just to rescue a couple of minor hypos. We were all in ketosis, but the people with type 1 diabetes had no different profile of ketones compared with those who did not have diabetes. None of us went into diabetic ketoacidosis. The two of us, the type 1s, had really flat normal glucose traces. So I felt that we covered all of those concerns in one go. So that's now been published in a medical journal, it's been peer reviewed. It's getting a lot of attention, but looking at the profile of people who are reading it, it's mostly people with type 1 themselves. And only about 10% of clinicians are reading it at the moment, even though it's in a clinical journal. It's a little bit disappointing in that sense, but I hope it will pick up over the months.
I'll have to put more effort into spreading it, I think. And I promise you I will. Every type 1 should read it, definitely, and every family member of type 1 diabetic should eat it, because we grew up, I mean, my family members used to tell me, you can't skip a meal. You've taken your insulin. We used to take insulin. This is how it was back in the maybe 80s, even 90s. We used to take the insulin before we were planning to eat. So then you had to eat. So I have a pump, or in fact it's a pod, the Omnipod.
Nice.
So you prove to all type 1 diabetics that you can have optimal blood glucose, blood sugar control without wearing a pump, with just the classic injections, and the CGM is all you need, and the keto lifestyle to manage your blood sugars well, don't you? So tell us about how you manage it on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so
injections.
When I started this, I made sure that my basal levels were right. So I had a period of fasting. I did a 24-hour fast, so I'm fairly good at fasting, whereas others may want to just miss breakfast and just monitor the effect of their long-acting insulin, whatever it is, Levemir or Lantus or Tresiba or whatever, and then skip the lunch and evening meal the next day and monitor the blood glucose. And if it's fairly flat, that means your basal level's about right. If it's going up or down, you'll need to adjust your basal to get a smooth enough profile. There'll always be a little bit of a spike, probably in the mornings for a lot of people. But if you're fasting, that then determines the amount of basal insulin that you need, the amount of insulin required to cover your background production of glucose by your body, mostly due to adrenaline and cortisol. And of course, the body needs to make its own sugar. You don't need to eat to make sugar so that you can provide certain areas of the brain with glucose, and also the red blood cells, which have to use glucose for energy. So once the profile's set, and I think it's always good practice to split your dose of long-acting 50-50, sort of 12 hours apart. The reason I say that is because you're putting smaller volumes in, so you're less likely to make errors, that's all. So if you've got, say, 8 units, which I use 8 units in the morning, 8 units at night, if you put that in at 8 and 8 and you happen to get it into a scar tissue or something, you'll rescue the situation later on in the day. So it's just much easier. And then it's just literally counting your carbohydrates and injecting the insulin according to your ratio. So if you've got, say, an insulin carb ratio of 1 to 10, which is typically used to start with,
yes,
you'll count your carb levels down to about 30 grams a day. And most people on a normal, nice guideline diet will have about 300 grams a day, so 10 times more. So if you're having 30, say you have 3 meals a day, or I have 2, but it's irrelevant, and so you split that up into equal amounts of carbs. So you're having 10 grams of carbs for your breakfast, say 10 grams for lunch, plus your fat and protein. And then you'll just use 1 unit of insulin for those 10 grams. If you're on 10 times as much, you'll need 10 times more insulin. And of course, that then starts to increasing errors, because it's just more difficult to manage 10 units of insulin as 1 unit of insulin. Your potential to drop your blood glucose is huge. So if you think of 1 unit of insulin drops your blood glucose by about 2 to 3, a little bit more in children, probably drops it 4 to 5. So if you just have 1 unit and it will drop your blood glucose by 2 units, even if you're 6, it'll only take it down to 4. Whereas if you have 10 units of insulin, it will drop it by 20 to 30 millimoles per liter of glucose. And of course, that's why you eat your carbohydrates to catch that up. But if you forget to eat your carbs, if they come late, your plummeting of glucose is precipitous, and that's why it's more difficult to control your diabetes with high levels of insulin and carbohydrates. The only other way I manage is to allow for protein. Protein does produce protein in excess, and will produce glucose, or the body will break down protein to make glucose if it needs it. So protein tends to cause a late onset effect of rise in blood glucose. So carbs, typically you'll get a rise half an hour to an hour, and with protein it'll go up 2 to 4 hours or something like that. So you have to anticipate a late rise of glucose due to the protein.
and if protein is combined with fat, which it often is,
yes,
it could have a late effect of, I don't know, 6. I mean, with me, it's quite often 6 hours later having a spike after my meal. 6 hours later, even if the meal contains no carbohydrate, I will need insulin just for the protein and fat.
Yes.
But not instantly, not immediately after eating or before eating. No, 6 hours later. It's fascinating, isn't it? So, so the best thing the type 1 can do is obviously to follow the ketogenic lifestyle, to avoid the highs and the lows, but also to use as little insulin as possible and achieve good blood sugar control. But how little is little? I mean, how many units should we use and feel comfortable about it? So 40, 50? I'm averaging 20 at the moment, and I feel good about it, but I don't know how I compare with others. Is it too much? 20 too much?
You use as much insulin as you need is the answer. Some people have more insulin resistance than others, and if you have a family history of type 2 diabetes, for example, and you also have type 1 diabetes, injecting lots more insulin than you really need will lead to some people developing type 2 diabetes in addition to their type 1. So they will become insulin resistant. So they may need more insulin to manage their blood glucose to normal levels. Others will need less, and as you become less insulin resistant, you tend to need less. It's my experience talking to quite a few people, probably 100 people now, that most people, this is anecdotal, this is a rough guide, use about 20 units of insulin a day. That's roughly what people settle at. So, you know, I have one patient who was on 120 units a day and she's now on 20. So it seems to settle for most people at around about 20. So I would say that's probably the body's background requirements for insulin. It used to be quoted as about 36 to 40. So I think it's 20. But that's not a target. That's just what a lot of people settle on. Others settle on 30 to 40. Very few people will go much higher than that if they're on a low carbohydrate diet. Yeah.
And when we're fasting throughout the day, the
well,
most amazing thing happens, because we drop. I mean, when I'm fasting throughout the day, I only need about 6 to 8 units of insulin.
Yes, we found that on the 0, 5, 100. I mean, my insulin levels dropped from 18 units a day down to between 4 and 6 units a day.
Amazing. So and you were exercising, of course, you were burning sugar too.
Yes.
Coming back to the 0, 5, 100 project, I know two of the participants were type 1. So looking at your results, I think the most fascinating thing for me was that you were functioning fully, both physically and mentally, on lower blood sugars, which most diabetics would regard as, I don't know, as a hypo or dangerously low blood sugars. But you were perfectly normal, you were alert and physically energetic at low levels. So how did that happen? Because I experienced that I could go the whole day on low levels, which in fact my Libre registers as hypo, but I know I'm not having a hypo. I'm fully alert. I'm not having a hypo. I'm not experiencing any hypo symptoms.
Yes, I mean the brain runs quite happily on beta hydroxybutyrate, which is the common ketone body, which is used for neuronal tissue. So, I mean, I've experienced also that I still have good hypo awareness, but it's often a little bit around just under 3 millimoles per liter. And of course, the traditional concept of hypo is a 3.5 and less. But one of our people with no diabetes, she spent a third of her time, well, 30% of her time, with a blood glucose below 3. That was measured on a CGM, continuous glucose meter, and she also checked her, sort of calibrated her CGM against a finger prick test. So it was reasonably accurate, we think. And she spent a third of her time below 3 and had no symptoms whatsoever. So we think you can run a little bit lower. However, it's difficult running a diabetes clinic because there are some people who with advanced diabetes and others who have got, you know, there are lots of different types of type 1. There are probably several different causes of type 1. And some people might have less ability to rescue hypos because they haven't got any alpha cells as well as beta cells. So they don't produce as much glucagon as they should, compare and insulin as well. And it may be that some people do have genuine hypo unawareness. I mean, I can run low, but I still have hypo awareness. So for me, I'm not about to just sort of go unconscious. But there are others who have very poor awareness of their hypos, and it makes it a difficult call, doesn't it? A difficult judgment call. So why would you want to drill it right down if you're not aware of your hypos? It's just putting you at risk. And of course, with driving, you need to be much higher, between 5 and 4, depending on whether you're using a CGM.
Is keto expensive, Dr. Lake? I'm sure we hear that quite often, and people are terrified because they think we need special ingredients and exotic certain types of seafood. So tell us about whether keto is expensive or not.
You could make, like all foods, you can make it as expensive as you want to. I did an experiment thinking, well, yes, we have a reputation in the keto world of being grass-fed meat and free range this and organic everything else, and it can therefore get quite expensive, can't it, if you're buying those sort of products. However, I set out to go to 2 supermarkets in the UK over a period of 2 weeks, and I bought what I'd normally buy, so nothing particularly exotic, but it included a meat and a fish meal and lots of vegetables. But the meat was bought at a supermarket, It was the best quality I could get for the price. So it wasn't the cheapest meat. It was sort of, it had sort of labels suggesting it was ethical standards, ditto the fish. So it was as good as we could get within the cost. And all of the vegetables were seasonal and British where possible. So there's no importation, and organic where possible. And the rule was buy organic unless you can't get it that week, if you see what I mean, that particular place. I chose Tesco's and Aldi because Tesco's supplies 50% of all supermarket food to Britain, and Aldi's got a reputation of being quite a cheap supermarket. And I got the over 2 weeks. I had to purchase more in week one, obviously, because I needed some ingredients like olive oil. You have to purchase big bottles rather than small bottles. And I got it down to £28.50 a week, which I thought was quite cheap, because the Office of National Statistics have estimated that each person spends about £38.50 a week on food. That would include takeaways, of course. So this was real food. It was unprocessed. It had to be prepared, but it was all prepared with literally a frying pan and an oven, and possibly a microwave, and about 5 utensils. And it was the most basic but effective, and that was 30 grams of carbs a day. And it worked. So it doesn't have to be expensive, but you have to eat according to your budget, don't you? But I think people should invest in their health rather than just buy the cheapest food, and cut down on some of the luxuries that aren't necessarily necessary. I'd sooner have better food than an extra t-shirt in my wardrobe, for example.
No, I completely agree. But also the fact that most people who are following the ketogenic lifestyle are eating only 2 meals per day, or even 1 meal a day, and they're not snacking every 2 hours. So that alone can cut down on food costs.
Absolutely. I quite agree with that. Yes. And if you get bones with your meat, if you eat meat and get bones, you can always make it into a soup and bone broth afterwards. So it makes it much more economical.
Dr. Lake, we're going to wrap up, but just for the last question, a lot of people are terrified of ketoacidosis as a result of following the keto lifestyle. I mean, nutritional ketosis has got nothing to do. It's completely different from ketoacidosis. Can you clarify that for us before we wrap up, please?
Yes, there's no reason why people in nutritional ketosis on the keto lifestyle will go into diabetic ketoacidosis because of that lifestyle. And the reason for that is you're burning fat on a keto lifestyle, so you will be producing ketones. On a conventional diet, you'll be burning sugar almost exclusively, and you may be storing your sugar as fat, because sugar gets converted to fat. So you will have no ketones because you won't be burning fat. So ketones come from fat burning. They're an inevitable consequence of fat burning, like water is a consequence of burning petrol, and carbon dioxide is a consequence of burning petrol. So those two products also are a consequence of burning fat. And you will produce ketone bodies. But if you have sufficient insulin in your body for those requirements at the time, you will be regulating your fat burning. So you will not go into diabetic ketoacidosis. And don't forget also, you are not starving, because you are burning off. You can breathe out, or you can pass ketones in the urine if they're in excess. So people say, oh, it's a starvation diet. Well, why are you actually burning it? Why are you actually excreting energy if you're in a starvation state? Clearly you're not. Otherwise your body wouldn't be so free with just excreting ketones, which are high energy molecules. So it's all about the amount of insulin you have on board and what sort of metabolism your body's going through. So if you're on a fat burning metabolism, you will have ketone bodies, you will have sufficient insulin, you'll be absolutely fine. If you're burning carbohydrates, you will have no fat burning, so you shouldn't have ketone bodies. So if you get ketone bodies when you're sugar burning, you have to think, well, why should this be? Because they're not normal. And I think that makes a lot of clinicians uneasy when someone like myself or yourself turns up to clinic and shows them your ketone profile, and it's 1, 2, or 3 millimoles per litre of blood ketone. And that's something outside of the experience of diabetologists. But if you have sufficient insulin, that's the key thing. So if you're injecting the right amount of insulin to keep your blood sugar normal, You will not go into diabetic ketoacidosis. Diabetic ketoacidosis requires too little insulin for the body's requirements at the time. You will have very high blood glucose levels.
Yes.
You will be dehydrated because you'll be peeing out a lot of sugar because your glucose levels are high, and you'll be forcing your body to burn fat in an unregulated way. So the ketone levels will go up and up and up relentlessly. So if you have an illness and your ketones are going up, just keep checking them, and don't be scared to inject more insulin if necessary. You may want to seek advice about that, but it's not possible to go into diabetic ketoacidosis as a result of a keto diet. Having said that, if I were to develop, say, septicemia, I may well end up in diabetic ketoacidosis because it'd be very difficult to keep up the insulin levels that are required. So you're not immune to diabetic ketoacidosis, but you won't get it as a result of diet.
That's right. Well, thank you for clarifying that for us. And thank you so much for your time. We'll have to do this again.
Yes, we will. And are you going to talk to us about your project with your fasting project, or is that a secret?
No, it can't be a secret. I have to share everything I'm experimenting on myself, but I will share it, and I'll certainly send you a copy. And
okay.
I'll be interested in what you think of it. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Lake. Hope you have a good evening.
Yes, and yourself. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.